meditation on the Westminster Confession of Faith, we'll look at the 6th chapter, the first section of that chapter, which reads as follows. Our first parents, being seduced by the subtlety and temptation of Satan, sinned in eating the forbidden fruit. This, their sin, God was pleased, according to his wise and holy counsel, to permit, having purposed to order it to his own glory. Some weeks ago now, we looked at the opening words of this section of the Confession and focused on the thought that we have a first pair of parents in Adam and Eve. They were a genuine historical couple, created by God within the garden and given a task to tend that garden. We recall the story that is recorded for us in Genesis chapters 2 and 3 of how they were entrusted with that garden and its care. They could eat from any tree of the garden but one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We made the point, in contrast to evolutionary thought, that Christian faith focuses on this one couple. And so all of humanity has its origins and its unity in this one couple. And there are multiple implications for that. First, in the nature of their sin and the transmission of that sin to all of humanity. If you have an evolutionary point of view with multiple strands from which humanity arose, portions in Africa, perhaps others in Asia and others in India, what have you, then you have lost the unity of the race. And so you could very well have a sense of the superiority of one race over another. One is more evolutionary advanced than another. You have what you have in Hitler's Germany, the rise of the Aryan race and the superiority of that race over others. The Jewish race being less pure, or other races being less pure. That was the product of an evolutionary worldview. A Christian worldview identifies all of humanity as one. We are united with the African, with the Asian, with the Indian, the Arab. We all come from the same parents. The other thing to note about our confession and the scriptures themselves is that this story of our first parents is rooted in real history and time. It was not given as a story with certain metaphorical truths to communicate to us so that we might know something about the nature of our sin or how it originates within the heart. The story is intended to be presented to us as true history. You know that in part by virtue of the fact that the story continues from the garden on into the descendants of Adam and Eve, to the flood, and to Abraham as well thereafter. History unfolds without any blink of an eye. Moses tells us what genuinely took place. That being said, then, there was a genuine temptation within the garden. There was a literal serpent there who tempted Adam and Eve. Satan came into that serpent and used that serpent to present a temptation first to Eve and through Eve to Adam as well. And so the scriptures in our confession note that there is a real Satan, a real devil. Evil is not merely a force. Evil is not simply a deficit in our natures. We are finite, and therefore it's only human to err. We all have our weaknesses, our limitations, and so therefore we err because of that. If you have a kind of metaphysical origin of sin, in other words, it's just a part of my finite nature, and it is who I am, then you can blame, if you're going to blame anybody, you can blame God for creating you in the way that you are, but you are excused because ultimately it's just who you are. It's a product of your chemicals, your biology, it's a product of your environment, what have you. But responsibility does not attend to you. The scriptures indicate that there is a genuine personal evil in Satan. An individual, an angel, who was in rebellion against God and came into that garden and brought a temptation to our first parents. When you look at their sin in eating the forbidden fruit, It was a rather abstract temptation presented to them, or a demand rather, that God placed on them. You shall not eat of this one tree. You can eat of everything else, but not from this one tree. Well, why? The reason was just because God told them, you will not eat from this one tree. And so God placed before Adam and Eve a real temptation as to whether, a real test as to whether they would obey Him simply in view of His Word. Whether they understood the nature of the command or not, just obey. Satan comes along, and there are three words here that the confession makes use of to describe Satan's actions here. First, our parents were seduced. They were deceived by Satan. They were led astray. There was something that was presented to them that seemed attractive. The fruit seemed to be pleasant to the eyes, delightful to eat, and so they wanted to eat of that fruit, and their eyes would be opened and they'd become wise. There's a certain fascination there presented to them. And that's the way temptation always comes. There's a kind of seduction. There is an appeal, something that excites us or appeals to us in some form or fashion. And Satan lures us in with that. So our first parents were seduced by the subtlety of Satan. Paul often talks about the stratagems of Satan. We're not unaware of his stratagems, his tactics in bringing temptation and leading people astray. He is an intelligent force, and he uses subtlety, sharp, fine distinctions. Quite often, for example, in theology, the difference between truth and heresy is but a hair's breadth. A very slight adjustment here or there, and you pass over from truth into falsehood, damaging falsehood. And on the surface, it might not seem all that important. There is a subtlety to the serpent's temptation, and we need to be alert that he uses these kinds of things to lead us astray. And he certainly did that with Adam and Eve. Has God really said? He questioned the nature of what God had to say, and then he threw outright doubt on what God had to say. He was bold in his opposition. And it was a work of temptation. It was an evil work of Satan. The confession, although it mentions all these things of Satan's evil involvement in leading our first parents into sin, does not then just blame Satan. It immediately says that our first parents sinned. So the sin was the responsibility of our parents. Even though they were seduced through the subtlety and temptation of Satan himself, they were nonetheless responsible for their actions. How often we'd like to be like that old comedian Flip Wilson and just simply say, the devil made me do it, and excuse everything on him. But Scripture does not do that. Adam and Eve were guilty of their sin. They needed to take ownership of it and be responsible for that in eating their fruit, that fruit. And finally, briefly, and we'll say this briefly because we considered this in other places, their sin, God was pleased, according to His holy, wise and holy counsel, to permit. Look at the words that the confession uses here. Permit and purposing to order it to His own glory. There are different shades of meaning to this in the way that the Scriptures present the rise of evil in the world. There is a certain measure of mystery here. We come to a place where God has not explained everything to us as to how it is that evil entered into the world. But we have enough to know what took place. And we need to rest that God knows all things and orders them according to His holy and wise counsel. He permitted this evil to occur, so it was under His control. He purposed it for a good purpose, ultimately for His own glory and praise. So the sin of Adam and Eve will bring great consequences to all of mankind, which we will consider, Lord willing, next time. But this is all under God's sovereign plan. We have a a God who is in control of all things and works all things according to